Well, hello there. It's David Bear here with winebaer, and today on Wine Conversations, we are speaking with a wine grower. Now, a wine grower is not the same thing as a winemaker. A wine grower is somebody who is responsible for what happens out in the vineyard. And the wine grower we have on our program today, his name is Mike Sauer. He is one of the owners of Red Willow Vineyard and another vineyard we'll learn about a little bit later in Yakima Valley in Washington State. So, welcome, Mike, to our program.
Thank you, David, for having me.
Well, great. So Yakima Valley in central Washington State. It's something that you and I know pretty well because we're living here in the Pacific Northwest. But many people out there who might be familiar with wines from the very famous growing regions around the world might not know Yakima all that well. Can you just give us a little bit of context for where it is and what Yakima Valley is all about?
David, so many people think of Washington State as a very wet region, rains all the time, but we're on the eastern part of the state, on the eastern side of the Cascade Mountain Range, and the Cascades act as kind of a rain, gives us a rain shadow effect to where we're actually quite a desert region. We get less than 8 inches of precipitation a year, very dry. Most of the vineyards of the Yakima Valley are located on east-west foothill ranges that kind of allows us to have a south slope to the vineyards, and the vineyards being above the valley floor to help with frost protection. So it's a very, very unique wine growing region. To the west of us on the Cascades, we see Mount Rainier, Mount Adams, these snow-capped former volcanoes. And a lot of the soil is influenced by volcanic activity over the millions of years.
Well, I had the opportunity to visit with you about 3 years ago, and I have to say that just visually, the entire geography is stunning. You have, the majestic views that you were just talking about, snow-capped mountains, but north and south of you, you have something sort of visually exciting too. What's going on there, and what is the influence of all of that in the work that you do?
Well, as I mentioned, the vineyards have to be off the valley floor to survive the winters and to be warm enough to grow the vines on the valley floor. There's just a plethora of different crops that are grown, hops, apples, wheat, almost every crop imaginable grows in the valley floor of the Yakima Valley. So it's very much a breadbasket of Washington.
Yeah. So that's an interesting point that you make. It's not just grapes that are grown in your region, and beyond that, it's not a single type of grape variety or a single sort of regional grouping of grape varieties. So. On your property, as best I can tell, and you have a better number than I do, but somewhere between 15 and 20 different grape varieties are growing on your vineyards. And let me just make a clarification for those who may have a picture in their mind of Red Willow as a vineyard that's producing its own wines. You are not. You actually sell your fruit to various clients, and we'll talk a little bit about the history of your clients momentarily, but you have a pretty broad range of different grape varieties on your property. Is that correct?
That's correct. I think what you're alluding to earlier was the variety of Concords, which is grown for Welch's, jam, and jelly. We started with those in the very early 70s. The Concords are located on the lower portions of our vineyard land where it's a little bit colder, but they survive the winters better.
Okay.
And then over the years, because we're a relatively new wine growing region compared to Europe anyway, we've experimented with so many different varieties, and surprisingly, most of them have done reasonably well.
Yep. And that's not very true in a lot of wine growing regions around the world. There's typically those, 5, 6, 7, 8 varieties that work really, really well in a given place. But I really appreciate the versatility of the Yakima region in general for being able to produce so many different things so well, and it's obviously, as we discussed, not just grapes, but many other types of fruit, and spearmint is another big crop in your area as well. So and many other things. So you now have the Concord grapes that you mentioned, which do not get made into wine, but made into grape juice for Welch. Are they a client of yours?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
But you also have wineries who are buying different types of grape varieties from you. And how many different clients do you typically work with in a given year currently?
Close to 20, David.
Okay.
Most of them are mid-sized to quite small wineries.
Okay. But that wasn't always the case, actually. You said you're a young wine growing region. Started back in the 70s in grape production for wine. Is that when wine production started off of your property?
Probably the very late 70s would be when the first wines were made from our vineyards.
Okay.
Yeah.
And at that point, you didn't have multiple clients making wine. To the best of my recollection, you had one. Is that correct?
We had one, but there were only 6 wineries in the state at the time. So it was in the late 70s.
Yeah.
The Washington wine industry was not very large at that time.
But you had one of the important producers of those 6 who has continued to produce, and you had and I believe continue to have a relationship with that winery exclusively, though, for several decades.
The one you're talking about is Columbia Winery.
Yeah.
That's correct. We started with them in 1978, and we sold grapes to them for almost 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
And the winemaker that was well known there was David Lake. He was a master of wine, and he brought so much knowledge to a relatively pioneer industry that probably knew very little about the grape varieties of the world and the wines of the world.
Yep. But it's pretty amazing how much we as North Americans have learned about wine and wine production in such a short period of time. We're talking about a span of 4, almost 5 decades that we've been producing wines at the level we have in North America, and it sounds like you didn't get started until really the late 70s, early 80s, working at that level. But David Lake, perhaps because he was European, if I remember correctly, is British.
He was British,
okay.
Also Canadian. It's in between. His parents were a military family, so they traveled around quite a bit. But David was very proud of his background in the British wine trade.
Okay.
And so he knew very well the great wines of Europe. He dealt with them, he sold them, and then he later became a master of wine and studied them.
And obviously had a major influence on the wines of Washington State as a result, because of all that he could inform personally. It sounds like. Yes,
yeah, that's absolutely correct. I often talk about a very proper, well-educated Englishman and a farmer being in the vineyards trying to share this vision together.
Yeah, well, that's amazing, and to have one person like David Lake having such a profound influence on the work that you've done, originally as a farmer of non-wine grapes, and in fact not even entirely grapes. We talked about some other things that, if I remember correctly, was it alfalfa, potatoes? You'll have to remind me what else was on
alfalfa seed, wheat, cattle.
All right.
The farm grew many crops.
Yeah. So you had then this new direction that you started going, and you had the benefit of David Lake. But David was actually not the only one who was helping in the early days with all of these new discoveries and this new exploration. So who else was there?
Well, David was the one we really started with, but one of the people that had a big influence on the direction of Red Willow was was a guy we met in 1983, Peter Dow.
Okay.
He had a restaurant over in the Seattle area, and he was very enthusiastic about Italian wine varieties, and he came to me and wanted me to plant an acre of Nebbiolo for him.
Now Peter Dow, for those who don't know, has a wine label. It's called Cavatappi. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And he is probably one of the better known Italian varietal producers in North America. So not too shabby a guy to tap you on the shoulder and say, "Hey, would you mind planting some Nebbiolo?"
Of course, when David heard we were going to experiment with Nebbiolo, he immediately told me, he said, "Well, really, I think probably a better variety, better suited to Washington State, would be the variety of Syrah."
Okay.
And so that really, Peter was a little bit the beginning of our years of experimentation with so many new varieties.
Now, one of the benefits that I think agriculture has in general is that very often there are universities and university extensions that participate in a lot of what you are doing out in the fields, whether they're helping with the funding or the research or something. And so you benefited in that way too, because I think you had some active participation from the academic world too. Is that correct?
You're absolutely correct. I guess I moved on with the story from what you were looking for. Really, when I started to even want to grow wine grapes, I went to the local county extension agent, and he said, "You should get hooked up with Dr. Walter Clore," which later became known as the father of the Washington wine industry. But Dr. Clore was very influential in the beginnings of our wine experimentation. He located a weather station at our place, a small experimental plot with about 20 different varieties in the plot. Most of them I'm sure you've never heard of. Gamza, Ricazzatelli, just a fauche, off-the-wall varieties, but we're looking at varieties that would survive the winters, and the winters were a lot colder at that time. And then they would make wine from several of these varieties at WSU and then have a taste panel at the college to evaluate these, and we found that they were quite successful. So Dr. Clore had a big influence in our experimentation in the early years.
Now, so you have talked about at least 3 external participants in your family's business, and obviously, you know, there's great excitement and opportunity in exploring new things, but you're also trying to run a business at the same time. So how do you balance all of that back then, seeing that there's this new developing industry, the wine industry in Washington State, that you're getting some advice from people who have some interest in seeing the industry develop statewide, but you have to make some critical decisions about how do you continue to have income coming into your business and also balance it with the experimentation. And I think one answer that just popped into my head is you probably had the benefit of a lot of land to be able to do multiple things at once.
Well, you know, Dave, there in the early stages of the wine industry, there were other farmers like myself. Mm-hmm. I mean, from the Hogues to the Balkman Moe, the Mercers, excuse me, quite a few farm families that were growing other crops. They were successful farms, so they had, I guess, enough money or resources, and this was a side project. Mm-hmm. And like many of the others, once you get going into wine grapes, it's exciting, it's challenging, it's interesting, and hopefully eventually it's profitable. Yeah. But so usually you're not starting off with a blank slate. You've got some land, mm-hmm. you know how to farm the ground, and there's some money from the existing farm behind you to start. Mm-hmm. And that's the way we were. This my son would represent the 4th generation of this family farm. It had quite a bit of land that it had acquired earlier, and we had probably a couple hundred acres that was quite steep. It was not suitable for farming alfalfa or wheat or anything else, and so it just started on a very small level, but planting small amounts of vineyards, and just success built on success.
So you talked a little bit about Peter Dow and his suggestion about Nebbiolo, but then David Lake comes back and says, well, maybe you might want to try Syrah. And in fact, Syrah is one of the things that Washington State has become very well known for internationally. But the fact is that you were a pioneer with that grape variety in the state of Washington. Can you talk a little bit about the history of Syrah on your property and how that all came about?
Well, I would have to give complete credit to David Lake for just the genesis of the idea of planting Syrah. I had no idea what the variety was about, the history of it, or anything. I mean, he mentioned that it was one of the great varieties from the Rhone. He really wanted to go after the concept that we were trying to emulate varieties that were from the northern Rhone, which is primarily Syrah, maybe with the possibilities of Viognier, but he really focused on the northern Rhone.
Okay.
And at that time, there were probably only two wineries on the west coast that were even producing Syrah. One was McDowell, and the other was Joseph Phelps. And even Joseph Phelps was not that many years into it. And so David, I said, yeah, we'll try it, David. I know a good hillside that would be suitable for it. And so David did the footwork of trying to contact some of the wineries to get cuttings. Of course, there was not a source of wood. It's not a common variety for nurseries to have at that time. So he contacted Joseph Phelps. They offered him two choices. They said, well, we have the Australian or the European clone. And of course, there's no question in David's mind. He would always go back to France if he had the choice. And so David secured cuttings for us from Joseph Phelps. And I remember they arrived in big boxes. These were dormant cuttings. And I think probably Syrah would have come eventually to the state. There's no doubt about that. The material that we got and the clone that we got was outstanding. Looking back on it, it was very clean. There were no viruses, no bugs or anything. And that was kind of we're talking about going back to about 1984 when we made this decision.
Okay.
And so very good wood material. We grew them. We gave them the hot water bath, everything that we could to ensure sanitation. And then we planted them in a nursery for 1 year. We grew the plants ourselves. And then in 1986, we set out the vineyard, which was the beginning of Syrah in Washington.
Yeah. And so those wines eventually were harvested in what year for the first vintage of wine?
Excuse me. Yep. 1988 would be the first vintage.
Okay. Wow. So, in some respect, not very long ago, but to be the first Syrah in the state is something that is a pretty big deal, particularly as we've discussed in a state where Syrah has become really one of the major stars of the wine production world. Now. So David thought that this was going to be a perfect variety, and you talk a little bit about the Northern Rhone. Are there, to the best of your knowledge, similarities with the Northern Rhone in terms of sun, exposure, heat, climate? How does Yakima Valley compare, or your particular site compare to sites in the Northern Rhone, if you know?
Well, I think many people that have told us, as far as looking at the wine itself, the wine seemed to be more or halfway between a French Hermitage. They're more structured. They're elegant. They're probably less like some of those of Australia that are just massively fruit forward.
Mm-hmm.
The wines are more similar to Hermitage or perhaps Cote Rôtie.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we're a more northern latitude, like Cote Rôtie would be.
Yep.
Quite steep, at least for our vineyards, quite steep hills. So I think we try to hope that we emulate Hermitage
Mm-hmm.
much.
Now, you have this one little French influence, the Syrah grape, and European. The cuttings, were they originally brought from Europe to Joseph Phelps before they made their? I guess before they planted and then developed and they made their way to you. Is that?
You know, there's we came across a book. He's a well-known author. The name escapes me right now. On the Rhone,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a chapter in that book that talks about Joseph Phelps and one of the very prominent Cote Rôtie producers, and in the Cote Rôtie producer's cellar, he had a bottle of Joseph Phelps wine, and they asked him, "Why do you have that?" And he said, "I'd like to keep track of where some of my cuttings went to." So I mean, it's a kind of a vague reference
Yeah.
point, but it's possible.
That's I've heard in the same breath Red Willow with wines from Red Willow with the wines of Gigal and Jabelet, who are two major Rhone producers, and talking about similarities in both qualitative as well as in personality of the wines, and perhaps there's something there. So that's fascinating. I have to put on my schedule the opportunity to open up those types of wines side by side from your property and from Cote Rôtie or Hermitage. That would be a great fun. Beyond the story that we've just shared, you have other French similarities and French influences that one wouldn't necessarily expect when arriving at your property. And one of them is this very iconic structure on your property, and the other one is the names of one of your vineyards. Could you talk a little bit about each of those?
Well, you're speaking about the chapel on at Red Willow Vineyard. It's we're a fairly spiritual family, and had come back from visiting Italy with Peter Dow,
Mm-hmm.
and I noticed just so many chapels, crosses, stone structures associated with the vineyards. And when we planted Syrah, David Lake once again jokingly mentioned, "Now you need a chapel on top of the hill." And I guess it got the mind turning a little bit, and I liked the idea. And combining with the European influence and things, we decided to build a chapel on the hill. One of our workers was a stone mason from Mexico. He was quite gifted
Mm-hmm.
with stones. So we had some rough images of chapels. We didn't have any blueprints or anything exactly, but we had some shapes that we wanted to emulate, and we set out to build this chapel. His name was Ezekiel. It took him 3 years to build the chapel from stones of the farm, and it's been an identity of the vineyard, our Red Willow Vineyards, for a lot of years. I think the reference point that you're alluding to is the name of Marcoux. Is that correct?
Well, yeah. First, just a point about that chapel. That chapel has appeared on many labels as well from lots of different wineries. I certainly have seen it on labels from Columbia, from Owen Rowe, and I'm sure others as well. So it's iconic in many respects, and to then see it in person, I feel like I'm somewhere in Europe, at that moment, and then I look north and south and I see that I'm not.
Well, the few trips that I've taken to both France and Italy, it really struck me of how they consider their land kind of differently than from many of us in America. They have specific slopes. As the slope changes a little bit, they'll change their variety. They have names of vineyards. They're small vineyards, and these were things that we were doing even before the chapel was built. And to us, I guess we've approached our vineyards more from a European perspective than we have a big development like in America. We have 80 acres or 200 acres or 500 acre vineyards. At Red Willow, we've always kind of treated each little corner, each slope, or we have vineyards that are down to 120 vines, yeah, even, and the soil is different, the slope's different, the irrigation system is different. So we've very much had this kind of European perspective of our vineyards.
I think I got a very good sense of what you're talking about when you were kind enough to drive me around some of the property and show me the demarcations of various plots, where soils changed, where exposure would be slightly different, and as a result you've decided to plant something different or differently in a certain place. I think you have lots of Syrah, but you're not growing the Syrah exactly the same way in all of those different plots throughout the property. So clearly you're making very specific decisions based on lots of different factors there.
I wish we knew what we were doing when we did them, but it's interesting to see how they turn out. You mentioned Syrah in particular. I think it reveals its terroir more than any variety that we grow, and we now have 10 different blocks of Syrah, and each one of them is uniquely different. It's amazing how they reveal the soil, the slope, the elevation so differently.
I'm curious, back in the 1970s, there was this shift in the beginning of the shift in the focus of what your family farm was all about. Did you have any interest in wine at that point, or has all of this come as a result of being connected tangentially to all of these wine producers throughout these years?
At that time, no, I did not have a connection with wine, but I was so intrigued with some of these French-sounding names, Chenin Blanc, Pinot Noir, right, and things like that. It took a number of years to even come close to pronouncing them correctly. Right. We often joke about the first planting of Cabernet Sauvignon that we planted. I was in the National Guard at the time, and I still remember we were riding in the back of a deuce-and-a-half truck, and one of the guys happened to be in the Guard also with me, managed the old Harrison Hill vineyards for Associated Vintners. Mm-hmm. And on the side, he was making grape cuttings in a nursery and then selling the plants. And he knew I was a farmer and dabbling a little bit with grapes. And he said, "I've got a whole truckload of Cabernet Sauvignon. It's a French variety, and I'll sell it to you cheap." And I didn't know if it was a red or a white, uh-huh, but are they good plants? And yeah, they're big plants. So I said, I'll take them.
Right.
So we started out with Cabernet Sauvignon, not exactly sure if it was a red or a white.
But you learned quickly. So I'm curious that you say that you didn't know how to pronounce certain French things because, I want to get back to the name Marcoux. Marcoux, when I first saw this name associated with you and your property, I immediately thought of a Rhone producer in Châteauneuf-du-Pape named Marcoux. But in fact, as best I know, there's no relation between you and them, but it is a French name.
As far as I know, there's no relation. David Lake and I have visited that winery, excellent winery.
A couple of sisters who I think own and make the wines there, if I remember correctly.
I don't know about that, but Marcoux is my mother's maiden name,
okay,
and the Marcoux, at least her genealogy goes back to about the first 500 people that came to Canada, right near Quebec, even slightly predating Quebec. And so the Marcoux have been French Canadians, and of course they would have come from France probably back in about 1600 or so. And so the name and the family history goes back a long ways. So even though I've got a name like Sauer that sounds German, I'm more French than I am German.
In many respects, it sounds like you're French by way of Joseph Phelps, or French by way of Quebec. So
Yeah, there you go.
Well, that's great. Now, I mentioned Marcoux a couple of times, but you actually have a vineyard site called Les Vins de Marcoux. Is that correct?
Yeah. That's how that came about. Is we had, of course, for years, pretty much exclusively sold to Columbia Winery, and then as their ownership changed and changed again. We mutually agreed to break off some blocks of grapes. They didn't need that many high-end grapes for a lot of their wine projects. So, but they very still wanted to be associated with the name of Red Willow Vineyard, and of course David Lake years and years ago designated a lot of their wines Red Willow or Sagemore or some of the other vineyard names. So they had a connection also with the name. So we agreed this, what we're calling the Marcoux Vineyards, is about 1.5 miles to the west of where the chapel is. Obviously, it's still managed by our family. It's owned by our family. But yet the ground and the soil is different than where the chapel area is. The soils are a little bit better. The wines always turn out much more fruit forward, rounder wines, whereas Red Willow near the chapel are often more structured, a little bit more tannic, more intense wines. So we thought, well, let's come up with an identity or a name for those vineyard blocks to the west. And once again, we're trying to somewhat keep Columbia associated with the Red Willow name. And so we came up with Les Vignes de Marcoux for wines from those particular blocks.
Now, you raise an interesting term just now that I wanted to just pick up on, because you said that in the Marcoux section of your property, the soils are better. But then you talk about the qualities of the wine over in the block where the chapel is, producing things that are bigger and more tannin and that sort of thing. So can you just help us understand what better soil actually means when it comes to the resulting wine?
Well, I definitely don't want to speak for other vineyards. I'll share my own experience. I mean, a lot of the vineyards that we're calling Red Willow near the chapel are very steep. It's a unique, roughly an 80-acre parcel that was an uplift and had a lot of volcanic material that was raised up and exposed. It's sandstone, volcanic pumice, gravel, a little bit of clay mixed in, and these wines are often very concentrated, intense. I guess David Lake would often call them wines with shoulders on them. They would age a long time. A lot of times they're slow developing, though, too. Especially the way David often made the wines. They wouldn't be ready to hit the market for 5 years at the best. And I've still got some of them in my cellar, and from bottle to bottle, they're still quite nice wines. Whereas the Marcoux does not have this poorness of soil. It does have some cement gravel overlaid with a sandy loam soil. It's I wouldn't say it's great farm ground, but it'd be more like farm soil.
Mm-hmm.
There's a slope to it, a higher elevation, so it's not like planting grapes on the valley floor.
Yeah.
But yet the soils are better. They're a sandy loam, and many times I think you receive more fruit forward wines from these. They're very pleasant wines. And an interesting little side story of Bob Betts, Betts Family Winery, very well-known winemaker and a spokesman for the industry.
And one of your clients.
Yes, yes. Secured some of the grapes from the Marcoux initially, Syrah block, and then a few years later was able to get some of the old original 86 planting of Syrah, which was on the very poor hillside called Red Willow. And he only wanted to make so much wine, and at the time he said, well, if I would like to pick up the Red Willow if I could drop the Marcoux. He didn't want to make a lot of wine. And he did that, very happy with the Red Willow, but when it came to the blending trial, boy, it's missing something. And he wanted to go back and pick up some of the Marcoux also. And we've run into a few wineries in recent years that have liked the combination of the both of them. It kind of gives them the yin and the yang of complexity to the wine, and yet it's still from Red Willow Vineyard. It's still a single source of grapes. So it adds complexity to a lot of wines when you can have different blocks of grapes.
Sure. And that's, I think, one of the benefits of having so many, so much variety in your raw materials, that you can, once your job is done, growing the best quality fruit that's distinctive to each individual plot. That's when the work in the cellar begins on the part of the winemaker, and that's a whole different kind of magic that happens in the next stage of winemaking that we'll discuss with a winemaker sometime. But this has been a great introduction and a bit of a retrospective on the work that you've been doing at Red Willow Vineyard. One of the most prominent vineyard sites and historic vineyard sites in all of the state of Washington, in its young but very, very productive years of growing and producing wines. Now, I don't even remember how many wineries or wine labels there are in the state of Washington, but it's a considerable amount at this point. Only about 4 decades into it. I'm picking a number out of thin air, but it was like 700 or 800 the last time I looked, and it's probably a lot more than that. Maybe
that's correct.
Yeah. So it's a big wine industry, and you have played a role in working with some of the leaders in that industry, and clearly as a grower you are a leader in the Washington wine industry as well. So I'm very, very happy to have had the opportunity to chat with you today about your property and about Syrah in particular, and hope that you and I will have the chance to connect again for our audience on a future conversation.
Thank you very much, David.
All right. Well, Mike Sauer, I appreciate your time, and we'll look forward to inviting you back onto Wine Conversations once again in the future. Thanks so much.
Goodbye, David.